inquiry, and surrender. What is the nature of the mind? The mind is nothing other than the I thought. The mind and the ego are one and the same. The other mental faculties, such as the intellect and the memory, are only this: mind, manas, intellect, buddhi, the storehouse of mental tendencies, chittam, and ego, ahamkara. All these are only the one mind itself. This is like different names being given to a man according to his different functions. The individual soul, jiva, is nothing but this soul, or ego. How shall we discover the nature of the mind, that is, its ultimate cause, or the noumenon, of which it is a manifestation? Arranging thoughts in the order of value, the I thought is the all-important thought. Personality idea, or thought, is also the root, or the stem of all other thoughts, since each idea or thought arises only as someone's thought, and is not to know and exist independently of the ego. The ego therefore exhibits thought activity. The second and third persons, he, you, that, etc., do not appear except to the first person, I. Therefore they arise only after the first person appears. So all the three persons seem to rise and sink together. Trace then the ultimate cause of I, or personality. From where does this I arise? Seek for it within. It then vanishes. This is the pursuit of wisdom. When the mind unceasingly investigates its own nature, it transpires that there is no such thing as mind. This is the direct path for all. The mind is merely thoughts. Of all thoughts, the thought I is the root. Therefore the mind is only the thought I. The birth of the I thought is one's own birth. Its death is the person's death. After the I thought has arisen, the wrong identity with the body arises. Get rid of the I thought. So long as I is alive, there is grief. When I ceases to exist, there is no grief. Yes, but when I take to the I thought, other thoughts arise and disturb me. See whose thoughts they are. They will vanish. They have their root in the single I thought. Hold it, and they will disappear. How can any inquiry initiated by the ego reveal its own unreality? The ego's phenomenal existence is transcended when you dive into the source from where the I thought arises. But is not the ahamvriti only one of the three forms in which the ego manifests itself? Yoga, Vashishta, and other ancient texts describe the ego as having a threefold form. It is so. The ego is described as having three bodies: the gross, the subtle, and the causal. But that is only for the purpose of analytical exposition. If the method of inquiry were to depend on the ego's form, you may take it that any inquiry would become altogether impossible, because the forms ego may assume are legion. Therefore, for the purposes of self-inquiry, you have to proceed on the basis that the ego has but one form, namely that of ahamvriti. But it may prove inadequate for realizing jnana. Self-inquiry by following the clue of ahamvriti is just like the dog tracing his master's scent. The master may be at some distant, unknown place, but that does not stand in the way of the dog tracing him. The master's scent is an infallible clue for the animal, and nothing else, such as the dress he wears, or his build and stature, etc., counts. To that scent the dog holds on undistractedly while searching for him, and finally it succeeds in tracing him. The question still remains why the quest for the source of aham vritti is distinguished from other vrittis, modifications of the mind, should be considered the direct means to self-realization. Although the concept of I-ness or I-amness is by usage known as aham vritti, it is not really a vritti modification like other vrittis of the mind. Because unlike the other vrittis, which have no essential interrelation, the aham vritti is equally and essentially related to each and every vritti of the mind. Without the aham vritti, there can be no other vritti, but the aham vritti can subsist by itself, without depending on any other vritti of the mind. The aham vritti is therefore fundamentally different from the other vrittis. So then the search for the self of the aham vritti is not merely the search for the basis of one of the forms of the ego, but for the very source itself from which it arises, the I amness. So then the search for the source of aham vritti is not merely the search for the basis of one of the forms of the ego, but for the very source itself from which arises the I amness. In other words, the quest for and the realization of the source of the ego in the form of aham vritti necessarily implies the transcendence of the ego in every one of its possible forms. Conceding that the aham vritti essentially comprises all the forms of the ego, why should that vritti alone be chosen as the means for self-inquiry? Because it is the one irreducible datum of your experience, and because seeking its source is the only practicable course you can adopt to realize the self. The ego is said to have a causal body, the state of the I during sleep. But how can you make it the subject of your investigation? When the ego adopts that form, you are immersed in the darkness of sleep. But is not the ego in its subtle and causal forms too intangible to be tackled through the inquiry into the source of aham vritti, conducted while the mind is awake? No. The inquiry into the source of aham vritti touches the very existence of the ego. Therefore, the subtlety of the ego's form is not a material consideration. While the one aim is to realize the unconditioned pure being of the self, which is in no way dependent on the ego, how can inquiry pertaining to the ego in the form of aham vritti be of any use? From the functional point of view, the ego has one and only one characteristic. The ego functions as the knot between the self, which is pure consciousness, and the physical body, which is inert and insentient. The ego is therefore called the Chitjada Granthi, the knot between consciousness and the inert body. In your investigation into the source of aham vritti, you take the essential chit, consciousness, aspect of the ego. For this reason, the inquiry must lead to the realization of pure consciousness of the self. You must distinguish between the I, pure in itself, and the I thought, the latter merely being a thought, sees subject and object, sleeps, wakes up, eats, and thinks, dies, and is reborn. But the pure I is the pure being, eternal existence, free from ignorance and thought illusion. If you stay as the I, your being alone without thought, the I thought will disappear and the delusion will vanish forever. In a cinema show, you can see the pictures only in a very dim light or in darkness. But when all the lights are switched on, the pictures disappear, so also in the floodlight of the Supreme Atman, all objects disappear. That is the transcendental state. No, transcending what and by whom? You alone exist. It is said that the self is beyond the mind, and yet the realization is with the mind. The mind cannot think it. It cannot be thought of by the mind, and the mind alone can realize it. How are these contradictions to be reconciled? Atman is realized with mruta manas, dead mind. That is, mind devoid of thoughts and turned inward. Then the mind sees its own source and becomes that, the self. It is not as the subject perceiving an object. When the room is dark, a lamp is necessary to illumine and eyes to cognize objects. But when the sun has risen, there is no need of a lamp to see objects. To see the sun, no lamp is necessary. It is enough that you turn your eyes towards the self-luminous sun. Similarly with the mind, to see objects, the reflected light of the mind is necessary. To see the heart, it is enough that the mind is turned towards it. Then mind loses itself and heart shines forth. The essence of mind is only awareness or consciousness. When the ego, however, dominates it, it functions as the reasoning, thinking, or sensing faculty. The cosmic mind, not being limited by the ego, has nothing separate from itself, and is therefore only aware. This is what the Bible means by I am that I am. When the mind perishes in the supreme consciousness of one's own self, know that all the various powers, beginning with the power of liking and including the power of doing and the power of knowing, will entirely disappear, being found to be an unreal imagination, appearing in one's own form of consciousness. The impure mind, which functions as thinking and forgetting alone, is samsara, which is the cycle of birth and death. The real I, in which the activity of thinking and forgetting has perished, alone is the pure liberation. It is devoid of pramada, forgetfulness of self, which is the cause of birth and death. How is the ego to be destroyed? Hold the ego first and then ask how it is to be destroyed. Who asked the question? It is the ego. This question is a sure way to cherish the ego and not to kill it. If you seek the ego, you will find that it does not exist. That is the way to destroy it. How is realization made possible? There is an absolute self from which a spark proceeds as from a fire. The spark is called the ego. In the case of an ignorant man, it identifies itself with an object simultaneously with its rise. It cannot remain independent of such association with objects. The association is ajnana, or ignorance, and its destruction is the object of our efforts. If its objectifying tendency is killed, it remains pure, and also merges into the source. The wrong identification with the body is dehatma buddhi. I am the body idea. This must go before good results follow. The I in its purity is experienced in intervals between the two states or two thoughts. Ego is like that caterpillar, which leaves its hole only after catching another. Its true nature can be found only when it is out of contact with objects or thoughts. The ghostly ego, which is devoid of form, comes into existence by grasping a form. Grasping a form, it endures. Feeding upon forms which it grasps, it waxes more. Leaving one form, it grasps another. But when sought for, it takes to flight. Only if that first person, the ego, in the form of I am the body, exists, with the second and third persons, you, he, they, etc., exist. If by one scrutinizing the truth of the first person is destroyed, the second and third persons will cease to exist, and one's own nature, which will then shine as one, will truly be the state of self. The thought, I am this body of flesh and blood, is the one thread on which are strung the various other thoughts. Therefore, if we turn inwards, inquiring, where is this I? All thoughts, including the I thought, will come to an end, and self-knowledge will then spontaneously shine forth. When I read Sri Bhagavan's works, I find that investigation is to be the one method for realization. Yes, that is Vichara, self-inquiry. How is that to be done? The questioner must admit the existence of his self. I am is the realization. To pursue the clue till realization is Vichara. Vichara and realization are the same. It is elusive. What shall I meditate upon? Meditation requires an object to meditate upon, whereas there is only the subject without the object. In Vichara, meditation differs from Vichara in this way. Is not dhyana meditation one of the efficient processes for realization? Dhyana is concentration on an object. It fulfills the purpose of keeping away diverse thoughts and fixing the mind on a single thought, which must also disappear before realization. But realization is nothing new to be acquired. It is already there, but obstructed by a screen of thoughts. All our attempts are directed to lifting this screen, and then realization is revealed. If seekers are advised to meditate, many go away satisfied with the advice. But someone among them may turn round and ask, who am I to meditate on an object? Such a one must be told to find the self. That is the finality. That is Vichara. Will Vichara alone do in the absence of meditation? Vichara is the process and the goal also. I am is the goal and the final reality. To hold to it with effort is Vichara. When spontaneous and natural, it is realization. If one leaves aside Vichara, the most efficacious sadhana, there are no other adequate means whatsoever to make the mind subside. If made to subside by other means, it will remain as if subsided, but will rise again. Self-inquiry is the one infallible means, the only direct one to realize the unconditioned, absolute being that you really are. Why should self-inquiry alone be considered the direct means to jnana? Because every kind of sadhana, except that of atma-vichara, self-inquiry, presupposes the retention of the mind as the instrument for carrying on the sadhana, and without the mind it cannot be practiced. The ego may take different and subtler forms at the different stages of one's practice, but is itself never destroyed. When Janaka exclaimed, "Now I have discovered the thief who has been ruining me all along. He shall be dealt with summarily," the king was really referring to the ego of the mind. But the thief may well be apprehended by the other sadhanas as well. The attempt to destroy the ego or the mind through sadhanas other than atma-vichara is just like the thief pretending to be a policeman to catch the thief that is himself. Atma-vichara alone can reveal the truth that neither the ego nor the mind really exists, and enable one to realize the pure, undifferentiated being of the self or the absolute. Having realized the self, nothing remains to be known, because it is perfect bliss. It is the all. Why is self-inquiry more direct than other methods? Attention to oneself, which is ever shining as I, the one undivided and pure reality, is the only raft with which the individual who is deluded by thinking I am the body can cross the ocean of unending births. Reality is simply the loss of ego. Destroy the ego by seeking its identity. Because the ego is no entity, it will automatically vanish, and reality will shine forth by itself. This is the direct method, whereas all other methods are done only by retaining the ego. In those paths, there arise so many doubts, and the eternal question, who am I, remains to be tackled finally. But in this method, the final question is the only one, and it is raised from the beginning. No sadhanas are necessary for engaging in this quest. There is no greater mystery than this, that being reality, we seek to gain reality. We think that there is something hiding our reality, and that it must be destroyed before the reality is gained. It is ridiculous. A day will dawn when you will yourself laugh at your past efforts. That which will be on the day you laugh is also here and now. You say one can realize the self by a search for it. What is the character of this search? You are the mind, or think that you are the mind. The mind is nothing but thoughts. Now, behind every particular thought there is a general, which is the I, that is yourself. Let us call this I the first thought. Stick to this I thought and question it to find out what it is. When this question takes strong hold on you, you cannot think of other thoughts. When I do this and cling to myself, that is the I thought, other thoughts come and go. But I say to myself, who am I? And there is no answer forthcoming. To be in this condition is the practice. Is that so? This is a mistake that people often make. What happens when you make a serious quest for the self is that the I thought disappears, and something else from the depths takes hold of you, and that is not the I which commenced the quest. What is this something else? That is the real self, the import of I. It is not the ego, it is the Supreme Being itself. But you have often said that one must reject other thoughts when one begins the quest, but the thoughts are endless. If one thought is rejected, another comes, and there seems to be no end at all. I do not say that you must go on rejecting thoughts. Cling to yourself. That is the I thought. When your interest keeps you to that single idea, other thoughts will automatically get rejected and they will vanish. And so rejection of thoughts is not necessary? No, it may be necessary for a time or for some. You fancy that there is no end if one goes on rejecting every thought when it rises. It is not true. There is an end. If you are vigilant and make a stern effort to reject every thought when it rises, you will soon find that you are going deeper and deeper into your own inner self. At that level, it is not necessary to make an effort to reject thoughts. Then it is possible to be without effort, without strain? Not only that, it is impossible for you to make an effort beyond a certain extent. I want to be further enlightened. Should I try to make no effort at all? Here, it is impossible for you to be without effort. When you go deeper, it is impossible for you to make any effort. If the mind becomes introverted through inquiry into the source of ahamvriti, the vasanas become extinct. The light of the self falls on the vasanas and produces the phenomenon of reflection we call the mind. Thus, when the vasanas become extinct, the mind also disappears, being absorbed into the light of the one reality, the heart. This is the sum and substance of all that an aspirant needs to know. What is imperatively required of him is an earnest and one-pointed inquiry into the source of the ahamvriti. How should a beginner start this practice? The mind will subside only by means of the inquiry, who am I? The thought, who am I? Destroying all other thoughts, will itself finally be destroyed like the stick used for stirring the funeral pyre. If other thoughts rise, one should, without attempting to complete them, inquire, to whom did they rise? What does it matter however many thoughts rise? At the very moment that each thought rises, if one vigilantly inquires to whom did this rise, it will be known to me. If one then inquires, who am I? The mind will turn back to its source, the self, and the thought which had risen will also subside. By repeatedly practicing thus, the power of the mind to abide in its source increases. Although tendencies towards sense objects, Vichara vasanas, which have been recurring down the ages, rise in countless numbers, like the waves of the ocean, they will all perish, as meditation on one's nature becomes more and more intense. Without giving room, even for the doubting thought, is it possible to destroy all these tendencies, vasanas, and to remain as self alone? One should persistently cling fast to self-attention. As long as there are tendencies towards sense objects in the mind, the inquiry, who am I, is necessary. As and when thoughts rise, one should annihilate all of them through inquiry then and there in their very place of origin. Not attending to what is other, anya, is non-attachment, vairagya, or desirelessness, nirasa. Not leaving self is knowledge, jnana. In truth, these two desires, desirelessness and knowledge, are one and the same. Just as a pearl diver, tying a stone to his waist, dives into the sea and takes the pearl lying at the bottom, so everyone diving deep within himself with non-attachment can attain the pearl of self. If one resorts uninterruptedly to remembrance of one's real nature, swarupa smarana, until one attains self, that alone will be sufficient. Inquiring who am I that is in bondage, and knowing one's real nature, swarupa, alone is liberation. Always keeping the mind fixed in self alone is called self-inquiry, whereas meditation, dhyana, is thinking oneself to be the absolute Brahman, which is existence, consciousness, bliss, Satchit Ananda. The yogis say that one must renounce this world and go off into secluded jungles if one wishes to find the truth. The life of action need not be renounced. If you meditate for an hour or two every day, you can then carry on with your duties. If you meditate in the right manner, then the current of mind induced will continue to flow even in the midst of your work. It is as though there were two ways of expressing the same idea. The same line which you take in meditation will be expressed in your activities. What will be the result of doing that? As you go on, you will find that your attitude towards people, events, objects gradually changes. Your actions will tend to follow your meditations of their own accord. Then you do not agree with the yogis. A man should surrender the personal selfishness which binds him to this world. Giving up the false self is the true renunciation. How is it possible to become selfless while leading a life of worldly activity? There is no conflict between work and wisdom. Do you mean that one can continue all the old activities in one's profession, for instance, and at the same time get enlightenment? Why not? But in that case, one will not think that it is the old personality which is doing the work, because one's consciousness will gradually become transferred until it is centered in that which is beyond the little self. If a person is engaged in work, there will be little time left for him to meditate. Setting apart time for meditation is only for the mere spiritual novices. A man who is advancing will begin to enjoy the deeper beatitude whether he is at work or not. While his hands are in society, he keeps his head cool in solitude. Then you do not teach the way of yoga. The yogi tries to drive his mind to the goal, as a cowherd drives a bull with a stick. But on this path the seeker coaxes the bull by holding out a handful of grass. How is that to be done? You have to ask the question, who am I? This investigation will lead in the end to the discovery of something within you which is behind the mind. Solve that great problem, and you will solve all other problems. Seeking the eye, there is nothing to be seen, because you are accustomed to identify yourself with the body and sight with the eyes. Therefore you say you do not see anything. What is there to be seen? Who is to see? How to see? There is only one consciousness which, manifesting as I thought, identifies itself with the body, protects itself through the eyes, and sees the objects around. The individual is limited in the waking state and expects to see something different. The evidence of his senses will be the seal of authority, but he will not admit that the seer, the seen, and the seeing are all manifestations of the same consciousness, namely I. Contemplation helps one to overcome the illusion that the self must be visual. In truth, there is nothing visual. How do you feel the I now? Do you hold a mirror before you to know your own being? The awareness is the I. Realize it, and that is the truth. On inquiry into the origin of thoughts, there is a perception of I, but it does not satisfy me. Quite right. The perception of I is associated with the form, maybe the body. There should be nothing associated with the pure self. The self is the unassociated, pure reality, in whose light the body and the ego shine. On stilling all thoughts, the pure consciousness remains. Just on waking from sleep, and before becoming aware of the world, there is that pure I. Hold on to it, without sleeping or without allowing thoughts to possess you. If that is held firm, it does not matter even if the world is seen. The seer remains unaffected by the phenomena. What is the ego? Inquire. The body is insentient and cannot say I. The self is pure consciousness and non-dual. It cannot say I. No one says I in sleep. What is the ego then? It is something intermediate between the inert body and the self. It has no locus standi. If sought for, it vanishes like a ghost. At night a man may imagine that there is a ghost by his side because of the play of shadows. If he looks closely, he discovers that the ghost is not really there, and what he imagined to be a ghost was merely a tree or a post. If he does not look closely, the ghost may terrify him. All that is required is to look closely, and the ghost vanishes. The ghost was never there. So also with the ego. It is an intangible link between the body and pure consciousness. It is not real. So long as one does not look closely at it, it continues to give trouble. But when one looks for it, it is found not to exist. There is another story which illustrates this. In Hindu marriage functions, the feast often continue for 5 or 6 days. On one of these occasions, a stranger was mistaken for the best man by the bride's party, and they therefore treated him with special regard. Seeing him treated with special regard by the bride's party, the bridegroom's party considered him to be some man of importance related to the bride's party, and therefore they too showed him special respect. The stranger had altogether a happy time. He was also all along aware of the real situation. On one occasion, the groom's party wanted to refer to him on some point, and so they asked the bride's party about him. Immediately he scented trouble and made himself scarce. So it is with the ego. If looked for, it disappears. If not, it continues to give trouble. If I try to make the who I am inquiry, I fall into sleep. What should I do? Persist in the inquiry throughout your waking hours. That would be enough. If you keep on making the inquiry till you fall asleep, the inquiry will go on during sleep also. Take up the inquiry again as soon as you wake up. How can I get peace? I do not seem to obtain it through Vichara. Peace is your natural state. It is the mind that obstructs the natural state. If you do not experience peace, it means that your Vichara has been made only in the mind. Investigate what the mind is, and it will disappear. There is no such thing as mind apart from thought. Nevertheless, because of the emergence of thought, you surmise something from which it starts and term that the mind. When you probe to see what it is, you find there is really no such thing as mind. When the mind has thus vanished, you realize eternal peace. When I am engaged in inquiry as to the source from which the I springs, I arrive at a stage of stillness of mind beyond which I find myself unable to proceed further. I have no thought of any kind, and there is an emptiness, a blankness. A mild light pervades, and I feel that it is myself bodiless. I have neither cognition nor vision of body and form. The experience lasts for nearly half an hour, and is pleasing. Would I be correct in concluding that all that was necessary to secure eternal happiness, that is freedom or salvation or whatever one calls it, was to continue the practice till this experience could be maintained for hours, days, and months together? This does not mean salvation. Such a condition is termed manolaya, or temporary stillness of thought. Manolaya means concentration, temporarily arresting the movement of thoughts. As soon as this concentration ceases, thoughts old and new rush in as usual, and even if this temporary lulling of the mind should last 1,000 years, it will never lead to total destruction of thought, which is what is called liberation from birth and death. The practitioner must therefore be ever on the alert and inquire within as to who has this experience, who realizes its pleasantness. Without this inquiry, he will go into a long trance or deep sleep, yoga nidra. Due to the absence of a proper guide at this stage of spiritual practice, many have been deluded and fallen prey to a false sense of liberation, and only a few have managed to reach the goal safely. The following story illustrates the point very well. A yogi was doing penance, tapas, for a number of years on the banks of the Ganges. When he attained a high degree of concentration, he believed that continuance in that stage for prolonged periods constituted liberation and practiced it. One day, before going into deep concentration, he felt thirsty. and called to his disciple to bring a little drinking water from the Ganges. But before the disciple arrived with the water, he had gone into Yoga Nidra and remained in that state for countless years, during which time much water flowed under the bridge. When he woke up from this experience, he immediately called, "Water, water!" But there was neither his disciple nor the Ganges in sight. The first thing which he asked for was water, because before going into deep concentration, the topmost layer of thought in his mind was water. And by concentration, however deep and prolonged it might have been, he had only been able temporarily to lull his thoughts. When he regained consciousness, this topmost thought flew up with all the speed and force of a flood breaking through the dikes. If this is the case with regard to a thought which took shape immediately before he sat for meditation, there is no doubt that thoughts which took root earlier would also remain unannihilated. If annihilation of thoughts is liberation, can he be said to have attained salvation? Sadhakas, seekers, rarely understand the difference between this temporary stilling of the mind, manolaya, and permanent destruction of thoughts, manonasa. In manolaya there is temporary subsidence of thought waves, and though this temporary period may even last for 1,000 years, thoughts which are thus temporarily stilled rise up as soon as the manolaya ceases. One must therefore watch one's spiritual progress carefully. One must not allow oneself to be overtaken by such spells of stillness of thought. The moment one experiences this, one must revive consciousness and inquire within as to who it is who experiences this stillness. While not allowing any thoughts to intrude, one must not at the same time be overtaken by this deep sleep, yoga nidra, or self-hypnotism. Though this is a sign of progress towards the goal, yet it is also the point where the divergence between the road to liberation and yoga nidra takes place. The easy way, the direct way, the shortest cut to salvation is the inquiry method. By such inquiry, you will drive the thought force deeper till it reaches its source and merges therein. It is then that you have the response from within and find that you rest there, destroying all thoughts once and for all. This I thought rises from me, but I do not know the self. All these are only mental concepts. You are now identifying yourself with the wrong I, which is the I thought. This I thought rises and sinks, whereas the true significance of I is beyond both. This cannot be a break in your being. You who slept also now awake. There is no unhappiness in your deep sleep, whereas it exists now. What is it that has happened now so that the difference is experienced? There was no I thought in your sleep, whereas it is present now. The true I is not apparent, and the false I is parading itself. This false I is the obstacle to your right knowledge. Find out from where this false I arises. Then it will disappear. You will then be only what you are. That is, absolute being. How to do it? I have not succeeded so far. Search for the source of the I thought. That is all one has to do. The universe exists on account of the I thought. If that ends, there is an end to misery also. The false I will end only when its source is sought. Again, people often ask how the mind is controlled. I say to them, show me the mind, and then we will know what to do. The fact is that the mind is only a bundle of thoughts. How can you extinguish it by the thought of doing so or by a desire? Your thoughts and desires are part and parcel of the mind. The mind is simply fattened by new thoughts rising up. Therefore, it is foolish to attempt to kill the mind by means of the mind. The only way of doing it is to find its source and hold on to it. The mind will then fade away of its own accord. Yoga teaches Chira Vritti Nirodha, control of the activities of the mind. But I say Atma Vichara, self-investigation. This is the practical way. Chitta Vritti Nirodha is brought about in sleep, swoon, or by starvation. As soon as the cause is withdrawn, there is a recrudescence of thoughts. Of what use is it then? In the state of stupor there is peace and no misery. But misery recurs when the stupor is removed. So Nirodha, control, is useless and cannot be of lasting benefit. How then can the benefit be made lasting? It is by finding the cause of misery. Misery is due to the perception of objects. If they are not there, there will be no contingent thoughts, and so misery is wiped off. How will objects cease to be is the next question. The Shrutis, scriptures, and the sages say that the objects are only mental creations. They have no substantive being. Investigate the matter and ascertain the truth of the statement. The result will be the conclusion that the objective world is in the subjective consciousness. The self is thus the only reality which permeates and also envelops the world. Since there is no duality, no thoughts will arise to disturb your peace. This is realization of the self. The self is eternal, and so also is realization. Abhyasa, spiritual practice, consists in withdrawal within the self every time you are disturbed by thought. It is not concentration or destruction of the mind, but withdrawal into the self. Why is concentration ineffective? To ask the mind to kill the mind is like making the thief the policeman. He will go with you and pretend to catch the thief, but nothing will be gained. So you must turn inward and see from where the mind rises, and then it will cease to exist. In turning the mind inwards, are we still not employing the mind? Of course, we are employing the mind. It is well known and admitted that only with the help of the mind can the mind be killed. But instead of setting about saying there is a mind and I want to kill it, you begin to seek the source of the mind, and you'll find the mind does not exist at all. The mind turned outwards results in thoughts and objects. Turned inwards, it becomes itself, the self. Even so, I do not understand. I, you say, is the wrong I now. How to eliminate the wrong I? You need not eliminate the wrong I. How can I eliminate itself? All that you need do is to find out its origin and abide there. Your efforts can extend only thus far. Then the beyond will take care of itself. You are helpless there. No effort can reach it. If I am always here and now, why do I not feel so? That is it. Who says it is not felt? Does the real I say it? Or the wrong I? Or the false I? Examine it. You will find it is the wrong I. The wrong I is the obstruction. It has to be removed in order that the true I may not be hidden. The feeling that I have not realized is the obstruction to realization. In fact, it is already realized, and there is nothing more to be realized. Otherwise, the realization will be new. If it has not existed so far, it must take place hereafter. What is born will also die. If realization is not eternal, it is not worth having. Therefore, what we seek is not that which must happen afresh. It is only that which is eternal, but not now known, due to obstructions. It is that which we seek. All that we need do is remove the obstruction. That which is eternal is not known to be so because of ignorance. Ignorance is the obstruction. Get over the ignorance and all will be well. The ignorance is identical with the I thought. Find its source, and it will vanish. The I thought is like a spirit, which, although not palpable, rises up simultaneously with the body, flourishes, and disappears with it. The body consciousness is the wrong I. Give up this body consciousness. It is done by seeking the source of the I. The body does not say I am. It is you who say I am the body. Find out who this I is. Seeking its source, it will vanish. How long can the mind stay or be kept in the heart? The period extends by practice. What happens at the end of the period? The mind returns to the present normal state. Unity in the heart is replaced by a variety of perceived phenomena. This is called the outgoing mind. The heart-going mind is called the resting mind. When one daily practices more and more in this manner, the mind will become extremely pure due to the removal of its defects, and the practice will become so easy that the purified mind will plunge into the heart as soon as the inquiry is commenced. Is it possible for a person who once has had the experience of Satchitananda in meditation to identify himself with the body when out of meditation? Yes, it is possible, but he gradually loses the identification in the course of his practice. In the floodlight of the self, the darkness of illusion dissipates forever. Experienced gain without rooting out all the vasanas cannot remain steady. Efforts must be made to eradicate the vasanas. Knowledge can only remain unshaken after all the vasanas are rooted out. We have to contend against age-long mental tendencies. They will all go. Only they go comparatively soon in the case of those who have made sadhana in the past, and later in the case of others.